I shall start. And this really is the second of the preliminary lectures before I get to the actual substantive topics, which in the next lecture at 11 o'clock I will get to a substantive topic, talking about the great Thomas Hobbes. But I want to say some more general points about the nature of history, about the nature of psychology, and why we should take a course called, why you should take a course called History and Concepts in Psychology. So in this lecture I'll be talking about why we, and I don't just mean you, I mean all psychologists, should reflect on the history of psychology, and why that fundamental question about psychology, is psychology a science, is to be understood historically. That you can't really deal with that question unless you have a sense of psychology's history. I shall also be saying, and it's a point of my course, that you can't understand psychology's history if you just take the psychology in isolation. That psychology's history is part of a broader history, a history of society. But if we ask the question, why do psychological theories become popular and then become unpopular? They seem to rise and fall. If you were taking this course 60 years ago, it would all be about behaviourism. Psychology would be the study of behaviourism, how to get pigeons to play ping pong and other clever things. Well, it isn't quite like that. Behaviourism seems to have dropped out. Why? Why is cognitive psychology so dominant now? Behaviourism you hardly hear. Well, the reason why theories rise and fall is often a historical reason. It's to do with the popularity of the image of the theory. These are to do with climates of opinion. And in this lecture I also want to give an argument why so much of the knowledge which social psychologists formulate, the theories of social psychologists, are themselves historical. They relate to historical times. They're not universal. And all this will edge towards the conclusion that good psychologists need to know about history. Not just the history of psychology, but to understand the history of psychology, they need a wider historical knowledge, and they need a historical consciousness to understand the knowledge which they try to produce. This is what I shall be trying to argue for in this lecture. Oh, I've forgotten, I must send round a record to get a history of who has attended or not. And I'll say a few more words, I said some last week, about the nature of the course. Look, I'm not under any illusions. If this course were an option, very, very few of you would choose it. I doubt if any of you would choose to study the history of psychology, especially if you heard that I was going back in my next lecture to the 17th century, to the 1600s. You would choose this course rather than if there was a glittering option on the psychology of internet communication or the psychology of modern shopping. You'd all flock to those courses. The psychology of what happened in the 17th century and the 18th century. There may be, and I would embrace them with all my heart, there may be one or two nerds amongst you who might like that, but the majority wouldn't. But I want to argue that it's important to look at history. It's important to understand the past. If you only know about the present, you won't even know about the present. And so my aim is not just to go back in the past and collect facts about what happened in the 17th century, but to do this to reflect on the nature of psychology. Because if we ask the question, how should psychologists study human nature? What should we think about our species? Well, one way to try and answer that question is say, well, how have psychologists viewed human nature? And psychologist is too restricted a word. How have some of the great thinkers about human nature thought? What ideas have they had? And above all, I want you to read in this course some original texts, some classic texts. I shall be dealing at times with work of Freud, William James, Darwin. Start off with the great Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes' next lecture. And I'd love you all to read some of these great works. Read them slowly. They're not easy. They're often written in unfamiliar language because the people wrote in years gone by. And as far as I can, I shall be dealing with English language thinkers. Freud isn't in that list. So that you'll read them in the original as they were written. And there's a reason why I want you to read these texts. Supposing I was lecturing on internet shopping. You're very eager to know about this. And I'll say, there's a latest article written on internet shopping. Go and read it. And maybe I might have written something on internet. I haven't. I might have been saying, go and read my latest paper. It's not yet published. And you'll think you're right there on the forefront of knowledge, reading the very latest things. But this is your education for life. Many of you will no longer be in the university after next year. If I just send you to the latest stuff, that stuff may not last. It may be forgotten in 5 years' time. And this education you've had will crumble because it will be based just on stuff which is up to the minute when you studied it, but then gets forgotten. Read Freud. Read William James. Read Darwin. And you are reading stuff which has lasted, which has quality because it's lasted, or the other way round. It's lasted because it has quality. You'll be gaining an education for life. You will be reading some of the greatest minds which have thought about human nature. And that's why I think it's important to study psychology historically. It will give you an education you can carry about with you for the rest of your lives. And it will enable you to reflect on the big questions, because the great authors thought about the big questions. Someone who does a study on internet shopping and shows young girls spend more money and buy things quicker than young boys isn't necessarily pondering on the big questions, which people will be pondering about when you're in your 50s, 60s and 70s, which your children and your children's children will ponder about. What is a science? Are there different sorts of sciences? And so on. Big questions. Let's start with a simple question. Why on earth study the past? Why look to the past? Why not look to the present and look to the future? What's happened has happened. We can't avoid it. Did any of you see the film? It came out a few years ago called The History Boys. You probably didn't. Yes, you did. It's about it's set in the 70s of grammar school boys being taught history by their teacher, and one boy who's not very scholarly doesn't like being taught history, and it's a wonderful phrase. He said, "History is just one fucking thing after another." And I think it's wonderful because it's true. Such an insight. And it's simple to say, well, if we study psychology, history's not needed, it's the past, it's just one effing thing after another effing thing. But, and then you say, the argument is like this, because most psychologists don't study history. Psychology is a science. What is one of the key characteristics of a science? Sciences aren't static, they advance. They build up knowledge after bits of knowledge and bits of knowledge and bits of knowledge. And if sciences advance, then the science of today is better and more knowledgeable than the science of yesterday, the science of the past. And if psychology is a science, that would be the same. But today's psychology is more advanced than yesterday's. And certainly more advanced than the day before's. And so if we really want to understand psychology, we should go to the latest journals, because they have the latest knowledge. And the latest knowledge, because psychology is a science and science is advanced, will be better than yesterday's journals. Look, you can say, go and look at the syllabuses in physics. If you went and studied a natural science like physics or chemistry, they wouldn't tell you to go and read Newton or read what chemists said in the 17th century. They'd say, oh, that's long been disproved. Oh, that's long out of date. No, here's the latest research coming out of MIT or Harvard or Cambridge. Go to the latest journals, read them up. This is the best science. We don't need to know what has been disproved. Now, that argument might work for the natural sciences. But what on earth has been disproved in psychology? In those discussions which you had in the first period last week, I asked you to think about facts. And no one, I think no one, reporting the talk of our group said, psychology's advanced because people used to think this and now it's been proved that in human nature. As if you could say about 17th century physics, people used to think that you could turn a base metal into gold if you just had the correct formula, but now you realise that you can't, because that's been disproved. What is it we know about humans now because something has been disproved in psychology? It's much harder to say. And actually, if you read some of the great old works, you'll find them full of wisdom. So you can say, well, all right. Let's deal with the question, is psychology a science? And get it out of the way. How should we say whether psychology is a science? Well, use philosophy, not history. Don't go back in the past and look and see old people. Please don't get me to read stuff written in the 17th century or 18th century. You might plead with me uselessly, I would say. But you say, well, I'll read modern philosophy. And I'll get a definition of what a science is, like go to the work of Karl Popper, the great Karl Popper. And he says a science must have these characteristics, particularly falsifiability, and look for refutations. And what we'll do is we'll go through some modern psychology and see if it fits his characteristic of being a science. And then we can get rid of this silly question. It was either say yes or no. Now, there's a big problem with this very realistic and sensible solution of going to philosophy, saying to the philosophers, please tell us what a science is, and we'll check up and see whether psychology is a science, and then we can have done with all this waffle. And the problem is that philosophy often describes what should happen, the ideal. The philosopher, like someone like Popper, is saying, this is what should happen if we're going to be scientific. We should phrase all our theories in a way that they can, in theory, be falsified. We should test them as rigorously as we can. And if we can't falsify them, we'll provisionally accept them as the best approximation to truth we have. Now, he can set out that for all he wants, Popper can. Good. But it doesn't mean that in practice, scientists will go about things, their profession, if you want, as the philosophers say they should. Scientists may look to confirm their views. They may hold their views as if they are true for all time and so on. That the ideal world may not match what happens in practice, and if we just then go to psychology and say, do psychologists practice psychology in the way which Popper says they should? And say, no, they don't. Oh, look, they do experiments to confirm hypotheses, not to get rid of them. And then, does that make it non-scientific? If someone says, and look, lots of chemists do the same, and lots of physicists do the same, and so on. And then you say, well, none of these scientists are scientific, and then you're left with a conundrum. Who on earth is properly scientific, and who says so? Now, there was a very important book for those interested in both the history and philosophy of science called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, written by Thomas Kuhn. And I will only summarise very lightly his conclusions. And basically, he looked at the history of physics and said, yes, Popper was right. You can't prove in absolute terms a scientific theory. There's no way of proving a scientific theory. Newton wasn't proved, Einstein wasn't proved. But where Popper went wrong was to assume that there's an agreed way to refute a theory. Popper said, oh, we need to refute a theory, as if it was obvious what counts as a refutation. And Kuhn said, if you look at the history of science, when you have some people claiming to have refuted another theory, you'll have other people say, no, it doesn't refute it, they've used the wrong method, or we can save the theory by adding this assumption and so on. But it's not clear-cut how you refute a theory. And Kuhn had a very, very interesting hypothesis about the way science works. And it's based on three concepts. One is normal science. And normal science happens when all the scientists within that discipline agree about the basic assumptions of their science and the basic methodology. They have an accepted paradigm, a way of doing science. And they happily do their research within this accepted paradigm, finding out little bits of information, adding piece by piece a little bit more information about how molecules work, or about how chemical substances work, or if they're Newtonians, how the universe, forces of gravity work, and so on. That's normal science. An accepted paradigm, people who go to study the science have taught this accepted paradigm, which is both theory and methodology, what you do. And then you have revolutionary science, where some groups of people say that normal paradigm doesn't work well. It's not good, it can't solve this problem, it can't solve that problem. And in revolutionary science, the radicals come up with a new paradigm, like Einstein against Newtonian physics, a new way of doing science, and saying, this is how we need to do things. And then you'll have a battle between paradigms. So normal science, everything is rather comfortable, but there's still things to do, always things to do in science. Science is never finished, more facts together. Revolutionary science, it's all in turmoil. A battle between paradigms. That was Kuhn's idea, basic idea. And it's been very useful talking about paradigms in science, and normal science and revolutionary paradigms, revolutionary times. And then Kuhn comes on to say something very striking. The success of a paradigm doesn't always happen because the previous paradigm has been refuted, shown to be wrong, so that everyone says, oh, yes, it was wrong. The success of a paradigm can depend on other non-scientific factors. There can be historical reasons why paradigms change at a particular time. And this new set of ideas becomes the dominant set of ideas, the normal way of doing things. The new paradigm might fit the mood of the times, might appeal to the outlook of a people living then and there. There may be extraneous reasons, not internal reasons to do with the paradigms and the scientific phenomena. And this seems particularly to be the case within psychology. Why within psychology do paradigms rise and fall with such frequency? Why do behaviours rise and fall? It became for a while, in the 1930s, 1940s, the normal way to do psychological science. And then it disappeared. It wasn't because it was refuted. Why did experimentalism come to dominate psychology? Oh, psychology is doing experiments. Why? Was it the old way had been refuted? And why, as we shall see, a particular way of doing experiments, not just any old experiment, a particular way of doing experiment. And what I would be suggesting in the coming weeks, you get these little victories. Not because the previous way of doing psychology, the previous paradigm, has actually been proved wrong. As Popper imagined, some decisive experiment shows it to be wrong. It's because fashions change. And why do fashions change? Because climates of opinion change. And to understand this, we need to look at the history of why theories seem to rise and why they fall, why this set of ideas is popular now, and why it then suddenly seems out of date. And this means not just looking at the theories themselves, but looking at their history, looking at the times in which they were formulated. Why did this view of human nature seem to appeal to people now? And why does it suddenly look out of date when times change? You see, the important point, and it's one which I will be stressing again and again, and which is why I go back unashamedly to the 17th century, 1600s, before psychology actually was there as a science. But psychologists, the big psychologists, are not just proposing particular theories or particular methods, saying, oh, this is a good method for observing this sort of thing. Oh, this is a good way of doing an experiment. If psychology were just a set of methodological procedures and practices, it wouldn't be very interesting. Why I think psychology is so interesting is because the big approaches, the big theories, propose different images of ourselves. We are humans. And we don't know what it is to be a human being. What sort of animal, what sort of species are we? What is our nature, our fundamental nature? And the great theories of psychology propose different images of humans. And sometimes these images look up to the minute. They mesh with other feelings and other currents of ideas. And sometimes they don't. So underneath so much psychology are a series of questions about the nature of human beings. Are we essentially rational beings, thoughtful beings, driven by cognitive processes? Or are we emotional beings, driven by feelings, irrational processes? And here's another one, and this is a huge one for anyone studying psychology, although we often forget it now. Can we have objective knowledge? Which means, can we see the world as it is? Now, psychologists often say psychology is a science, which means it's objective. And once a psychologist says that, and says psychology is worth studying, they are implying that as a species, we can be scientific, we can see the world as it is. That we, above all other species, can have objective knowledge. But then the strange thing is, so many psychologists who say we can have objective knowledge, when they observe human beings, when they analyse the mind, seem to come to the conclusion that knowledge is subjective, that the way we think is structured not by the outside world, but by the structure of our own minds. And that how I view the world reflects my subjective position, my position here. The way you view the world will be different. And the way you view the world will be even more different. But we're all locked into our own minds. And we see the world according to our own perspectives. And there's a big question about the nature of human beings. Are we capable of objective knowledge? Or are we fundamentally subjective, locked into our own feelings and perspective on the world? And then there's this other question. Are humans unique? Is there something very special about humans and our minds? Or are we at root just biological creatures? As much the inheritors of our species and its DNA as our cats and dogs. And we can ask the question, where do these images of humans, our objective, of rational, as subjective, as animals, where do they come from? And why, not are they methodologically important, but why are they historically important? Why at one time do people believe that we are special? And at other times they believe, no, we're just animals. And sometimes they think, yes, we can be scientific. At other times, no, we all have our own subjective point of view. There's no methodology for settling these questions. Now, so that's one answer to the question, why should we study history? Because these big theories, these big questions about human nature, underlying psychological theories, are very historical. They rise and fall, they become popular and unpopular. Then there's another argument. But if we're going to be good psychologists, if we're going to understand our experiments, not only should we do them nicely and methodologically correctly, but we should be able to think historically as we interpret the knowledge which we produce. Now, it is fundamentally true, I think, that most psychologists, not all, but most, ignore history. They don't just ignore the history of their discipline, of psychology, but they don't think historically. And you can see this, the way, particularly social psychologists, how they go about things. They have an idea. Go back to your last year in Introduction to Social Psychology. Is it true that frustration leads to aggression? Is it true that cognitive dissonance leads us to try and soften the dissonance or whatever? I have an idea, and it's a universal idea. Festinger, when he thought of cognitive dissonance, didn't just say, oh, this only affects North Americans today. He assumed it was universal. All human beings are affected by the problems of cognitive dissonance. And frustration, aggression, frustration would always lead to aggression. It wasn't just a specific society where this would occur. And they do their experiments, and then they assume that those experimental results apply to everyone universally, across society and across historical periods. But if you could have tested people in the Middle Ages, in 1200, they would have reacted to these experiments in just the same way. But there's a big argument that good psychologists, good social psychologists, I'm not talking about perception or some sorts of memory task, although I would argue that it does affect them, but it's clear in social psychology that good social psychologists should interpret their results in terms of history. I've put on the reading list and for you to on the Learn server, so you can see an article by Roger Smith, who's a historian and a historian of psychology and psychological ideas, writing in The Psychologist, which is the magazine of a British Psychological Society, and arguing that psychologists should be aware of history, should have a historical consciousness. And for two reasons. One, to be aware of the place of psychology historically, in history, and to be aware that much psychological knowledge is itself historical knowledge. It refers to knowledge of the times in which it was produced. What do I mean by this? And what does Roger Smith mean by this? Why is social psychological knowledge historical? let's take the experiment, which is probably the most famous experiment in the whole history of social psychology. Do you know, those of you with your, I'm going to say, do you know what experiment this is? But I see some of you with the overheads, and you'll know what I'm going to say. It's the great Milgram experiment, where Milgram asked people, ordered people to deliver shocks to another person which they thought, and ostensibly the shocks seemed to be very dangerous. You know this experiment. Christian lectured you about it, didn't he? You've probably, those of you who've done A-level have studied it, so you're probably fed up to the back teeth of Milgram, but I'm going to say more about it. Now, the big result, and it was a great shock at the time, was about 70% of Americans at that time were prepared to give the XXX maximum danger shock to an innocent victim, or a victim who seemed to make mistakes. Now, let's pause a moment. What sort of finding is that 70% were liable to give the extreme shock? Okay, you can say it's a shocking finding, but beyond that, does anyone want to say what sort of fact that is? Well, the essential characteristic is that it's probabilistic. It's talking about the probable numbers of people of a given population who behave in this way. It's like if I took 10 of you, 3, 6, 7, and you 3 there, all 10, and I'd probably say, on the basis of the Milgram results, 7 of you would give maximum shocks, and 3 of you wouldn't. But I couldn't say which 7, and I couldn't say which 3. Because it's not predicting that everyone will behave in the same way. And this is why psychological knowledge like this is not like knowledge gathered by a chemistry experiment. If you do a chemistry experiment properly, and you've isolated one set of chemicals, one chemical, and you've isolated another chemical, and you add one to the other, and you get an explosion, the chemist would not be happy and say, well, it will occur 70% of the time. If it will only occur 70% of the time, something's gone wrong with the chemical experiment. The equipment's faulty, the equipment's dirty, you haven't actually isolated the chemical substances. The chemist is looking to see what happens 100% of the time. Take this chemical, add it to this chemical, and bang, you get it. No one says to Milgram, oh, you haven't got your experiment right, because you can only say 7 out of 10 people do it. You can't tell me that 100% of people do it, and you're not telling me what's the difference. But psychological knowledge, by and large, is probabilistic knowledge. It's more uncertain than a chemist's knowledge. And it's no coincidence, not only that chemists in most of their studies don't use statistics, that many of the developments in statistics have been created by psychologists. Instead of saying, oh, statistics are a sign that we are scientific, statistics are a sign, actually, that we're not like the natural sciences. But more than this, the Milgram proportions are historical. Milgram cannot say, it will be true whenever you do this experiment and whatever the subjects, but only 7 out of 10, or as many as 7 out of 10, will go the whole way. And Kenneth Gergen, in an article, again, which I put on the Learn server, which says we should treat social psychology as if it's history, makes a very, very important point. That the Milgram experiment doesn't produce absolute findings. It doesn't say this is true of human beings wherever they've existed. It's only true relative to the historical and social context in which the experiment was carried out. And that was the 1960s in the United States. What Milgram found in the 60s in the States is no guarantee that if the experiment were to be redone now, 50 years later here in Britain, you'll get the same probabilities. Actually, we can't redo it. We're not allowed to. It's considered unethical. That the probabilities, the ratios of those obeying to those disobeying could change in different times, in different contexts. It could also be that you could have a culture where you couldn't do the experiment at all, as is becoming a culture like that, or that the people just wouldn't understand what they're meant to do. It's like, this is stupid. So you can't say that Milgram found a universal truth. But you have to understand what he found in terms of the historical and social context, where and when it took place. When Newton formulated his theory, he didn't say, well, gravity just works now and works in Britain, but it may not work in Italy or may not work in France. No, these are universal truths. And the same when a chemist now predicts that this chemical will lead to this chemical reaction, these two chemicals will produce this reaction, doesn't say, oh, well, it's only true now, 100 years' time, oh, it'll all be different. The chemistry of the world will be different, the chemical laws will be different. No. Natural scientists produce universal, or seek to find universal laws, whereas the social psychological findings, which social psychologists find, they're relative. They're relative to history. And Gergen says this is a broader point than just trying to interpret Milgram. He says that all social psychological knowledge really is historical or social. It relates to the times and the place in which it was produced. But the great mistake is most social psychologists treat their results as if they're universal, as if they're true for all human beings. And they have no empirical evidence for this assumption. Because normally it's not tested. And you can't go back in history and say, in the 1300s people would have responded in just the same way. You can't. In different times, people might behave differently. And the proportions of people behaving this way rather than that way. So you can ask the question then, if this is the nature of social psychological knowledge, how can we know how people would have behaved in the past or how they will behave in the future? We've got our findings from now. 7 out of 10 behaved this way, 8 out of 10 behaved that way, and so on. But was it always like that? Will it always be like that? We can't know. Everything is always provisional. But we can try to use historical knowledge. Knowledge about our times and how they differ from past times in order to interpret the findings we get. To say these findings are true now, but would they have been true in a society which is different from ours? A society in which obedience seemed to be demanded more of children, or was demanded less than now? And to answer that, we can't go back in time and say, well, how would people have reacted to the Milgram experiment 200 years ago? But we can try and look at that society of 200 years ago and say, well, I think it may have been very different. And the way we think of the mind now is very different from then. And so perhaps things would be different. And the general conclusion then would be that we need to understand present findings in terms of history to understand their significance. I don't mean statistical significance. And this is very, very different from the way which physicists or chemists understand their experience. They don't need that historical knowledge to interpret their results. They will assume that the chemical reactions are true universally. And therefore, there's a number of implications. If you're doing psychology, especially if you're doing social psychology, don't generalise from one population to everybody. Don't think the world is always the same and has always been the same. And that means don't assume that psychological knowledge on its own, just the knowledge of what's been proved in experiments, is sufficient for understanding the issues of social psychology, or even sufficient for understanding those results. The results have to be understood in terms of wider knowledge about culture and about behaviour. And this is why both Gergen and particularly Roger Smith think, and I agree with them both, think historical knowledge is so important for understanding what you do as a psychologist. Not just that you should be interested in the history of your discipline, but if you're going to be a good psychologist, you need more historical knowledge. That history, which most psychologists, that's just the past. But they should have it in order to be better social psychologists. And you need historical knowledge of psychology, but more than just psychology, the times in which psychology and psychological questions have been posed, to understand the nature of psychological knowledge. Why theories rise and fall. To understand a theory you may like, you should have some knowledge of where it's come from, what it replaced, and why it too may be replaced in time. And this comes back to a general point. To understand the present, to understand the questions of the present, which probably interest you much more than the questions about the past do. To understand what effects the internet may be having on people's thinking, to understand what's going on in the world today in your lives. To understand that, you've got to understand where you've come from. Otherwise you'll have nothing to compare the present with. You'll just assume the present has always existed, that things are always like this. They're not. To understand the present, I think, you have to know something about the past. So, I'm going to start in 5-10 minutes with the 17th century. So Thomas Hobbes, and I realise I haven't put his dates there, 1588 to 1679. A man of many years ago. And I'll give the background. He's one of the great thinkers, one of the great philosophers, political theorists, really, and a problem. The background politics and his views on human nature, his views on science, and his analysis of the mind. And it's because of he had a view on human nature and a way to analyse the mind that we can think of him as an early psychologist. And it's the psychology of the individual, and he poses the problem very clearly of a problem between reason and emotion. Are we basically reasonable, rational creatures who can be trusted? Or do we have emotions which we can't trust? Well, Hobbes feared the latter, that we were not to be trusted. And he stresses the importance in human behaviour, the way we are created in our being, of the motive of self-interest. We're a self-interested species. But I want to say why he thought this. And what it implies. Now, before I plunge into the world of the 17th century, let me say a few words about periods in the history of psychology which I'll be covering. The first part of the course really is about the 17th and 18th century. And for those of you who don't know, the 17th century means the 1600s. The 18th century is the 1700s, just like we are living now in the 21st century. We're living in the 2000s. And the 17th and 18th century is a particularly interesting time for historians, because it's a time which is the birth of modern science. Galileo, Newton, William Harvey. It also coincides with the time when some thinkers like Hobbes tried to analyse the human mind. How do we think? What's going on in our brains? And they did so because they wanted to ask questions about human nature. What sort of beings are we really in ourselves? And from that, to answer that, you need to look and say, well, how does the human mind work? This will give us a clue about our nature. This is early psychology. It's not modern psychology, certainly not in the methodological sense. It's not scientific psychology, if psychology is scientific. These are not people who did experiments, as would be recognised by experimentalists today. But often they were great thinkers addressing the question, how does the mind work? When we go into the next century, the 19th century, we'll see there's much more of an attempt to use biology and physiology to study the mind. And it was right in the middle of the 19th century when the Darwinian revolution occurred. And never again after Darwin will people think of humans in quite the same way. But again, this wasn't psychology as we know it. You had to wait to the end of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries before psychology was established as a discipline, which meant you could go to universities, very few people did go to universities in those days, and take a degree in psychology. 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, early 19th centuries, you couldn't. And it was in the late 19th centuries we see the development of the experimental approaches in psychology. So when I go back to Hobbes in the 17th century, nothing like this is occurring. Darwin is yet to come. No discipline of psychology, no experiments, no statistics, you'll be pleased to know. A happier time, was it? Actually, it wasn't. Now, here is something which I think is genuine from the history of psychology. Now, by and large, there's no point studying human beings if you're just going to find out what everyone knows. You've all come to university to study psychology. I don't think any of you would think of studying, have chosen this subject, if you thought that at the end of 3 years of study, you're only going to know what everyone knew, what you knew before starting to study, what your parents could have told you. I could have told you that humans are like this, and so on. You're hoping to find out something about humans which you wouldn't know by common sense, which you wouldn't know by ordinary observation, but you'll find out some secrets about humans which you can only get if you study humans systematically. And so you could say that ordinary people know a lot about humans. We all know a lot, common sense. But the point of doing it as a study is trying to find out something which common sense doesn't teach you, which goes beyond what everyone knows. It's to find some hidden secrets. And to be able to say something like this. Most people think people are X, whatever X is, reasonable, unreasonable, whatever. But really, if you look closely, if you look at the facts, they're a bit different from what people think they really are. They're X and Y's. And some of the great theories are like this. Freud, for example. Most people think human beings are quite moral and upright beings. But really, said Freud, they're driven by the motives of sex and aggression. And the more moral they present themselves, the stronger these hidden motives. So people studying under Freud, accepting his theories, will be able to say, I've got a hidden knowledge about human beings. Skinner, the behaviourist, was just the same. Oh, you think human beings are very complicated, and you think they're rather grand. But just like pigeons, they're controlled by rewards and punishments. Humans do things they're rewarded for, and they avoid things they're punished for. And it's as simple as that, says Skinner. We like to puff ourselves up as complicated creatures, but we're not. People like to think they're hidden and mysterious, but really they're just like animals controlled by reward and punishment. Evolutionary theory. People like to think of themselves as special. especially religious people, God created humans differently, but the evolutionists say, really, we're just like animals. And Hobbes, oh, I do have his dates there, was one of the early theorists proposing a view like this. Everyone thinks humans are X, but really they're Y. Everyone thinks humans are really special and they're pious and they have a sense of morality, but rather like Skinner and a bit like Freud, he was saying, you look clearly at humans. Cut away all the assumptions and you'll find out rather nasty, selfish creatures. Just driven by to maximising their own rewards and minimising their own punishments. Rather like Skinner said. Now, I'm not going to ask the question, is it true or not? Let's change the question. And ask the question, what sort of times would it produce a theory which says humans, you can't trust them. They think they're high, very big concepts of morality, but basically they're rather unpleasant and selfish. It's a time when two things are going on. One, and this is true of Freud's times as well, and Skinner's, but certainly of Hobbes, is a time of great faith in science. New science is arriving. We can find the truth. We can find the truth about the stars. We can find the truth about the circulation of the body. Maybe we can find the truth about the mind. And it's a time of fanaticism, of war, conflict, political fanaticism, where it's natural not to trust people. Go back to 17th century Europe, the early modern period, the start of the modern era in politics and science. It's a time when humans started questioning their place in the universe. No longer the sun going round the earth going round the sun. Maybe we were smaller than we thought. But no psychology as a subject, and the word psychology in English didn't exist. You couldn't say, oh, Hobbes could never say, I'm a psychologist. People would say, what? What's that strange word? And England, which is where Hobbes lived, it's a time of change, fanaticism and civil war. England today, and I say England, not Britain, because this is before the Act of Union. Wales was part of England, but not Scotland. Was a very different place. No, the times were very different from now. It's very easy to think that England was always England, or the England that we know was always the England that we know. But it wasn't. We like to think of England today as a moderately peaceful, very peaceful place, a democratic place where if we have problems, we sort them out democratically. And you sometimes will hear politicians talk about England as being the home of democracy. We have a long tradition of democracy. This will be said by people who don't really know history. Democracy didn't always exist in England. Peacefulness didn't always exist. Not the present President of the United States, the one before, Bush, used to compare the East and the West and say the West has this long culture of democracy and the East, well, the Muslim culture was anti-democratic. Only someone who was deliberately blind to history would make one like that. When we look at the England of the 17th century, what country does it most resemble in today's world? I think it's closer to the Iraq of today than it is to the England of today. It was a time of religious fanaticism. It was a time when people would be burnt, tortured for their beliefs, if they had the wrong religious belief. It wasn't just a matter of someone letting off bombs against them. They might be burnt alive, or even worse, have parts of their body, while they were still living, cut out of them. They had slow death watching these people dismembering their body, and then their heads would be put on stakes to be seen by the rest of the population for weeks and weeks. A primitive time, you might think, but also a time of great scientific discovery, an odd time. In England, at the start of the 17th century, start of the 1600s, royalty was formally Protestant. The Henry VIII, the previous century, broken away from the Roman Catholic Church, not greatly because he thought Roman Catholic doctrine was wrong, but he just was sick and tired of the power of the Pope. He wanted a divorce, and the Pope wouldn't let him divorce. And so he declared himself the head of the Church of England, and England became pro-Protestant and very anti-Catholic, but not extreme Protestant. And what you had during the 17th century, 1600s, was a rise of Protestants, particularly extreme Protestants, who were very anti-royalty and often very egalitarian. And sometimes the radical, fanatical Protestants were England's Taliban, if you want to make an analogy. And there was great civil unrest. There was a challenge of Parliament against the authority of the king. And during the reign of Charles I, where it all exploded, there was great distrust by the Protestants against the king. He wasn't doctrinally very much a Protestant, but because the kings then tended to marry other queens and princesses, his wife was a Catholic. And the Protestants started reacting against the doctrine of divine right. Why? Charles I said he had a right to rule England because God had given him that right. It's a divine right of kings. And the Protestants said, you may think your God's given you that right, but our God hasn't. You have no right to rule over us. And the violence broke out in 1642, the Civil War in England. Basically between the royalists supporting Charles I and the parliamentarians who were led by a brilliant military leader, a rather hardline fundamentalist, Oliver Cromwell. And some of the worst fighting, and it was a dreadful war, took place here in the East Midlands. It started in Nottingham. Charles I raised his standard in Nottingham to signal he was going to war. Nottingham soon fell. civil wars can be worse than wars between different nations. Families can be divided. You can't trust your neighbour. Are they going to, if you say something to your neighbour, maybe they don't have the same views as you, maybe they're going to report you to other authorities, maybe there's going to be a knock on the door, and they're going to drag you through the streets and burn you as a heretic. In 1649, something very, very dramatic happened. Charles I was not just deposed because the parliamentarians were winning, he was executed. And instead of finding another king, for 11 years, between 1649 and 1660, England became a republic. It was called a Commonwealth, a protectorate, ruled by Honour King Cromwell, who refused to take the title of king. Cromwell died, his son took over, Dick Cromwell, and he really wasn't up to the job, and the republic fell. Monarchy was restored, and back from the continent came Charles II to take over. And since then, we've been saddled with monarchs. Now, Hobbes, born 1588, he was a mature man. His adulthood was spent during this troubled time. He was born in Wiltshire and was often called the gloomy sage of Malmesbury. Well, when he was young, he went to Oxford. Actually, not a great deal is known about his early life. His father was a vicar, but seems to have not had anything to do with Thomas or Thomas's mother, sort of left him. After Oxford, Thomas Hobbes took the career path which many bright young people of those days took, which is to become a tutor employed by one of the leading families, the aristocratic families. Because Hobbes he was middle class, but he wasn't of the top aristocratic rank. He worked for the Cavendishes and for the Earl of Newcastle, teaching their children Latin and Greek, the classical education. And you would predict from this, well, he might have spent the rest of his life teaching the children of the better off, of the aristocrats, basic Latin and basic Greek. But his mind wasn't satisfied with that education. He became increasingly interested in the natural sciences, and particularly geometry. And he was aware of the storm about to break out in the country. And Thomas Hobbes was cautious, politically. He wasn't a radical. If anything, he was a cynic. He didn't really believe in the kings, that they had a divine right. But he worked for the aristocrats and thought, actually, we're better off sticking with the kings, putting up with them, because they will be able to provide peace. Whereas the radicals, they're just going to overthrow things and lead to mass slaughter and disruption. Now, Hobbes, as a royalist, he fled to Paris before the outbreak of the Civil War. He didn't wait, he went off. He knew it wasn't safe. And he wrote his book, Human Nature, which I've put one of the chapters on the Learn server in 1640. He just finished it just before the outbreak Civil War, where he expressed his fears about what was going to happen, and his psychology was based on a distrust, a fearfulness that human beings weren't as nice as they like to think they are. And his big work was also written in exile, The Leviathan, for which he is justly famous. It's really a work of political theory, but it's based on his psychology. And while he was in exile, he became tutor to Charles I's son, who thought of himself as Charles II after the execution of his father. And he returned to England in 1652, which is why the Commonwealth was in power. The Civil War itself had just finished, but there were still burnings and distrust. But poor Hobbes, he returned to England, not necessarily because he thought it'd be safe, but he was living in France, and that became unsafe. He was suspected of being anti-Catholic in a Catholic country, and he feared that he was going to be murdered by the authorities in France. So, choosing the least worst option, he went back to England. I say all this because it was a dangerous business being an intellectual in those times. It wasn't just that you could be sacked from your job for your ideas. You could be burnt to death, you could be executed for them. And he worked for the Cavendish family when he returned, and one of their properties, they owned properties in the East Midlands, and he lived and then died at Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire. Hardwick Hall is open to the public if any of you next summer want to tour East Midlands stately homes. It's where Hobbes lived for a number of years, where he worked, where he died. And if England were like France, which values intellectuals, Hardwick Hall would be noted for its connection with Thomas Hobbes, who, when he died, was recognised to be one of the greatest minds in the whole of Europe. But England isn't like France on this matter. We love princesses, we love princes, we love Harrys and Williams, even though they've done bugger all. Hardwick Hall. Oh, last time I went round, there was a whole gathering of people round a big painting of a rather glamorous princess. And the guide was saying, doesn't she look like Princess Diana, Mrs. William and Harry's mother? And down the bottom was a tiny little picture, the only picture of Hobbes in the whole house, the only mention of Hobbes, the greatest person to live in that house. And something within me wanted to scream and interrupt, but I'm far too much of a coward to do so, and say, don't look at her, she did nothing. She's a nothing, she's only just a pretty princess. This bald man, and Hobbes was very bald, even balder than me. I'm pleased to say, this bald man is the greatest person who's ever lived in our land. Princesses, aristocrats. Ugh. No wonder Cromwell fought against them. Now, Hobbes, in his philosophy, has expressed a distrust of people. Personally, he wasn't that distrustful, but in general he was. And he particularly distrusted the religious fanatics, the equivalent of a Taliban. People who think of themselves as righteous people with a God-given mission to correct the beliefs of others. But for Hobbes, their behaviour was just as bad as criminals. and with a civil war which he feared was going to happen when he wrote Human Nature, he saw the collapse of any organised society and the emergence of a very barbarous human nature, where life isn't valued greatly, where people couldn't trust other people. Imagine you're living in Iraq today. You can't necessarily trust your neighbour. Say something in the street to someone you don't really know. Or in Afghanistan, it may come back to you with violence. And Leviathan, his great work of politics, reflected his fears for society. And his big question was, what sort of government should we have? What's the right government? And the way he answered the question wasn't in terms of human rights or democracy. It was in terms of psychology. It was, what is human nature? If we study human nature, we'll know what sort of government we need. It's all very well formulating a theory in theory, but it's just a theory. And his answer was, we need a strong society, a strong government, because you can't trust people. And that's why he was a royalist. He thought a king, and he didn't have to be a king, could be a dictator. Any strong figure of authority would provide security for people. So he wasn't a royalist because he believed in the divine right of kings. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that Hobbes, quite shockingly, probably didn't believe in God. Not that he could ever say so in those days, because whoops, there would go his head rolling down the street. And his early psychology was a part of his politics. And the politics were part of a reaction to those dangerous times. But human nature, we were selfish, and we were lawless, and we can't be trusted. And because of our weaknesses, our endemic weaknesses as human beings, we need a strong authority which will say, don't do this, don't do that, don't follow your own personal interest. Because if everyone follows their own personal interest, there'll just be chaos and violence. There's a famous passage in the Leviathan where he depicts what would happen if there's no firm authority. And it's an image of civil war. It's an image of chaos. There'll be war of all against all. And he imagined a time before society was set up, before there were kings, before there were anyone in place of authority, just people individually living their lives. In such condition, there is no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain. You don't know what's going to happen. You're just living in the now. Consequently, no culture of the earth, no way of, no agriculture, no navigation, no use of the commodities that may be imported by sea. No commodious building, big buildings. No instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force. No technology. No knowledge of the face of the earth, no geography. No account of time, no watches. No arts, no letters, no society. And which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Very famous passage. Now, I'm going to ask you a question, because works written several hundred years ago have different meanings, different words from today. What do you think he meant by industry? Just shout out. No industry. What do you think he was referring to?
Work.
Sorry?
Work.
Work in general.
Work in general, yeah.
Exactly, work in general. He wasn't referring to factories, because this is before there were big factories. It is when times were very industrial. He meant industry being industrious, being working, putting your pleasure to one side as you go out and do your duty. And what Hobbes thought is if we were just, all of us, governed by our own immediate wants and desires, society would unravel. And unravel at a cost to all of us. But our lives would be nasty, brutish and short. And that underlies the work of Human Nature, his book Human Nature, where he tries to analyse the mind. And what he's doing, and why I say it's an early psychology, he's trying to apply the scientific thinking of his times to understand human nature and looking what he called his analytic method at how the mind works. And he thought that the analytic method was you try to examine your own mind systematically. And you have to examine your own mind, how you think, because you cannot see the mind of anyone else. I can't see your mind. You can't see her mind, and so on. So if you want to know how the mind works, you have to look inside your own mind. And this was an assumption of most thinkers who tried to examine thinking of a mind before, in the late 19th century, experiments were set up. That you have to just go inwards to yourself. Actually, it's a mistake. Because when Hobbes wrote the Leviathan, in that passage, he wasn't saying, oh, I've looked into my mind and I have all these horrible thoughts, all these horrible desires, and only if I see the image of a king bearing down on me do I stop thinking of it. No, he was looking outwards. He was looking at other people. He once said, no, it's in the Leviathan he wrote, but people think he's exaggerating when he says we don't trust anyone. When he says, do you lock your door when you go out? If you lock your door, then you think others are not to be trusted. Lovely, lovely turn of phrase he had, lovely insight. Now, he starts the analysis of his mind, as many would do later on, with perception. Why? It's the belief that we get knowledge about the external world through our senses. So if we want to understand how we think, what our minds are like, start with perception. And his account of perception is really a physicalist account. It's based on the notion of motion. And then motion was the big word, the buzzword, which if you used motion, you were being scientific. Let me see. Ah, yes. Look at this. I'm looking at the key. The object, there must be, for me to see it, there must be motion from that object to my eye. Something must go from that object to my eye. What it was is going, moving, Hobbes doesn't specify. But there must be motion in some way, physical motion, from the object to the eye. But that's not good enough. There must be another set of motion, sets in motion, in play, another set of motion from the eye to the brain. And that's not good enough because we also have to react. And then there's another passage of motion from the brain to the heart. And Hobbes believed the heart was the seat of emotions. And the heart will tell us whether we like what we see or don't like what we see. If we like what we see, we'll approach it or grab it. Ah, my key, yes! Ah! Or, I don't want that key. Someone will accuse me of stealing it. Ooh. And so it's a physical description of motion via the optic nerve to the brain motion to the heart, and from the heart to action. And the concept is the importance of motion, which he derived from Newton, and therefore a scientific approach, and is not really based on analysing himself. He's not saying, oh, I felt the motion. Yes, I could feel the motion down to my heart. No, it's really looking at other people and thinking what must occur. And at the root is that he's giving importance to motives. That motion from the brain to the heart and then the heart to the arm or the leg or whatever. But perception gives rise to reaction. And the reaction in the heart is based on either pleasure or pain. Actually, Skinner would say something similar later on. It's either a reward or a pain. You see something you like or someone you like, and your heart tells you, approach them. I'm not going to give an example, because that would be wrong of me if I picked on one of you and said, watch me approach you. No. But it's also, if you see someone you don't like, if I suspected you of belonging to the Taliban, or the English Taliban of the 17th century, run away, can't see me. And at root, as I say, it's similar to, in this part, to what Skinner would talk about, behaviourism. It's a simple view of human motives. Approach, avoid. Pleasure, pain. But it's the basis of his claim to hidden knowledge. You think humans are very wise and very moral, but if you look at how the mind works, all of this morality, all of this wisdom disappears. You just see people getting pleasure and avoiding pain, trying to satisfy their own individual interests and motives. You think people are moral and pious and worthy, but really, the great religious people saying you shouldn't do this, you should do that, all they're doing is saying what they like. I like the Bible, I like people to be good and so on, and avoiding what they dislike. Ooh, I don't like sin. Every man for his own part calleth that which pleases, and is delightful to himself, good, and evil which displeases. In short, by starting and looking at the operations of an individual's mind, with perception, what goes on in the mind, he comes to the conclusion, which is a cynical conclusion, but it's a very subjectivist conclusion. We all have our own preferences, and although we call them by moral names, they're just our preferences. What I think of as good is just what I want to do, what pleases me, what I want to approach. It's not objectively good, it's just there my set of preferences. This is why Hobbes feared for his life. Even the goodness which we attribute to God Almighty is his goodness to us. He's saying to the religious people, you say God is a good God, God is glorious and whatever. And that's just all you're doing, is saying, you like God. God is good to you. God is a good concept to you. He's actually saying, there is no good. There is no God. It's just what you think of is good and God. You can see this would have been dynamite in those days. It's an anti-religious message. It's also a tolerant message in some way, because it's saying no one has a monopoly of truth. All we have are our own subjective feelings, and we should be careful of these feelings. Because what he's saying is, underneath all the pious morality, there's just self-interest. I like this. I don't like that. I get a reward for thinking this. Your thoughts displease me, and so on. It's stripping away the language of morality and replacing it by a simple psychology. And he's also saying, if we do this, if we analyse the mind and see our thoughts as based on what we see and what we feel, and if our moral judgments are just judgments about what that person feels, basically you can't trust individuals. Everyone is driven by their own sense of goodness, but their own sense of goodness is driven by what they like. We call our self-interest moral, but it isn't. It's just our self-interest. And that's why we need an authority to control us, because if we didn't, all we'd be driven is by our limitations and weaknesses. Each person would seek out his own and her own satisfactions and try and impose on others their own will and try and avoid what they don't like. There'd be no sense of a common good. This needs to be imposed on us. We need a government, an external authority to say, look, this can't go on. You can't just go about your own business in the way you want. You can't just try and get pleasure how you want. You have to take into account other people. There's certain actions we're called wrong. You'll have to work. You'll have to have industry. Industry, as you correctly said, in its broad sense. Without that, no one will bother working. They'll just be trying to get quick pleasures. It's a cynical view. It's a fearful view. With hindsight, we can see how someone who lived the life which Hobbes lived, on the fringes of things, but seeing terrible disorder of his times, might be driven to this fearful, distrustful view of human nature. But it's not just because he's suspicious that he has this view, because there's an other side of Hobbes, as there was the other side of England, of Europe in the 17th century. That other side, the quest for science, using the most scientific concepts, the most scientific ideas of his day, looking at the mind treating the mind as an object of scientific inquiry, sketching out this view that which is obviously true, that we get our ideas of the world through our senses. Who could doubt that? And that we have feelings to what we see. And some things we approach and some things we shy away from. All this is true. And all this seems to lead to a simple subjectivist position. And then for hundreds of years after, the great thinkers would say, there must be something wrong in Hobbes' reasoning. What has he missed out? It seems such a distrustful, such a cynical, such a wrong view of human activity, a reduced view of humans. But he seems so scientifically correct. You can't see goodness. You can't see God. These are all constructs of the mind. No, the mind seems to be selfish. How come science, a scientific approach, is leading us to this view of humans which seems to fit the worst of times and the worst of humans? That is the problem which will underlie the next few lectures I give. Okay, questions? And remember, if you don't want to ask a question now, or a question occurs to you later, please leave.